So there's this really interesting live stream that I watched recently. It's about 6 hours long. So if you choose to watch it, good luck. It'll take you a few days probably. But it was on the channel, the Weeb Crew, who are two guys who tend to have on a special guest to talk about some topic related to anime or manga. And they had one live stream in which they reacted to a video by the other YouTuber, F.D Signifier, his video about masculinity in anime. And what's interesting about this live stream is, first of all, there's two guests who sort of jump in. The first one is another YouTuber named Pause and Select, also known as Joe, whose channel focuses on bringing academic applications of theory to anime manga studies. And eventually, about 2 hours in, F.D Signifier himself joins the live stream. The first place to start is, of course, F.D Signifier's original video, which he is sort of looking at anime in terms of his portrayals of masculinity, and he's looking at it from the position of both a father and, I believe, a social services worker. I'm not entirely sure if he specifies or not, but he mentions that he works with younger boys and men for a living. And so he starts examining what he believes to be positive and negative depictions of masculinity in anime. And the first one he uses as a positive example is My Hero Academia. Sort of the idea that people want to keep growing out of a certain social responsibility that they feel, and this is emblemized in the rising power of each character. And however, there's never really a sort of end goal to their strength or anything. It's just you keep accruing power for the sake of doing it. It's the journey, the pursuit of those things that is more important than necessarily the end goal. The end goal is just that pursuit to keep going, to keep growing. And in terms of the negative depictions of masculinity he kind of turns to isekai. And this is where Pause and Select starts really to criticize and break apart the conceptions of F.D Signifier. First, on his sort of lack of contextualization of anime itself and all of its different genres, categories, and demographics that it might appeal to. Because what happens is that comparing something like a shonen battle manga adaptation to an isekai kind of falls apart a little bit when you consider that in Japan, a lot of isekai are, first off, independently published, like web novels, just sort of thrown onto a website, but have over the past 10 years become more prominent in terms of anime adaptations. And some of that has started to pick up and cross-pollinate with other fantasy manga and anime. So that's, make of that what you will. But Joe points out that in Japan, a lot of isekai is written by and for like 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, much older men. He sort of singles out in one example, office workers, like businessmen, who, in the case of My Hero Academia, Joe sort of points out that this conception of the endless pursuit of power, just this constant expansion, is a sort of neoliberal take on this idea. And he compares that to isekai and says, what F.D Signifier views as a negative conception of masculinity, that oftentimes in these shows you have a male character who's sort of the center of the universe, but specifically is surrounded by other harems of other beautiful women who go to him primarily for reasons that are considered shallow, like his modesty, his hard work and effort, and what's sort of viewed in this case as a kind of a psychoanalytic thing where you're assuming this is a more negative depiction of masculinity because you're assuming that the person who's writing it and the person who's watching it are specifically imagining themselves in their position and wanting wanting to view themselves as these nice people to be rewarded specifically with all of the sort of material and fetishistic fulfillments they end up having and accruing over the course of the story, and which is different from something like My Hero Academia, where you just sort of, you don't really expect anything in return. You just accrue power for power's sake, for yourself and for social purpose. But again, what Joe wants to bring up is that, with many of these like businessmen, these people who live in like a late capitalist society where they have terms to describe the phenomenon of working themselves to death, they consider this more neoliberal outlook of My Hero Academia to be a sort of null prospect, because of course they may have tried that, but the system itself doesn't really enforce these idealistic pursuits that something like My Hero Academia might portray. And therefore, in isekai, these older men are sort of killed by the system of Japanese society and whisked away to a world in which their unique expertise in media savviness can be used to help restructure all the problems with the existing structures. Specifically, like Log Horizon's a really good example. Slime Isekai, very good example. And then he also brings up a case of a female-led isekai, which is I've been killing slimes for 300 years and I maxed out my level, where the main character in that one quite literally did work herself to death in Japan before she's reincarnated in the fantasy world, and has a very staunch philosophy of not worrying and not stressing about getting things done right away. She wants to take it easy and says there's no rush. We can just wait. We can slowly put things together. I don't know why I decided to walk for this video, but I feel my breath is just like not keeping up with my pace. But Joe's bringing this up and saying it's really weird to actually think about why we would be comparing My Hero Academia with these isekai. Their demographics are very different. Their depictions of masculinity are really going for very different things, and based on the original context of which these isekai were published and created, their understanding of masculinity and their at least desires to depict it are more nuanced than we're giving it credit for, because fundamentally someone like F.D Signifier and many other people who sort of view isekai as a thing for young men to project onto have fundamentally misinterpreted who they were meant for and what they were meant to signify. And it's hard to blame them. Part of this reaction or response video is not really to judge anybody or to blame anyone for getting these things wrong, because I don't blame them. And the reason is because exactly like what F.D Signifier is afraid of. As a father, he says, if you go onto something like Crunchyroll or on the Netflix, and you have Spy Family here, and then right next to it, it's going to be something like Mushoku Tensei, which I've never seen Mushoku Tensei, but I hear it's kind of controversial. So, if you're a father, you probably don't want your son to be watching that at too young of age. But because of our current anime distribution models, lumping all of them together with no real distinguishing between demographic, we have some categories of genre designation usually built into those streaming services. Like Crunchyroll has all these little menus with different tags and stuff, but fundamentally and teleologically, they do not distinguish anime from other anime. And Crunchyroll is very unique in this regard. At least it kind of is now, but where we have an entire streaming service dedicated to one thing. And that one thing is something that in Japan, theoretically, when a person who's lived with anime their whole life, they don't really see it as a foreign product. We look at anime as anime because anime, in our sense, is a foreign national product from Japan. It used to be, designated Japanimation. But the term anime nowadays, at least if you ask Stevie Suwan, has accrued many different performative functions of its identity. So, you know, we see it as anime, they just see it as any kind of animation, kind of, because now they also have started becoming more aware of foreign perceptions of anime that has distinguished their nation's animation from the rest of the world. So it's a little tricky, and the problem with America is that we have sort of shallowly defined all anime as just anything that's come from Japan that is cartoons, and by doing that, we have sort of torn down distinctions between all of them that in Japan might have had a more properly compartmentalized ecosystem. Like, Mushoku Tensei on TV airs late at night, whereas something like My Hero Academia or Spy Family, I don't know exactly when they air, but they may air on different channels with a different age bracket. They may air, maybe nighttime, but not late at night, maybe during the day. And so those kind of context-specific things are completely lost in translation. And again, it's very hard to blame anyone for not knowing that or considering it beforehand, because all of our distribution models have set up such a thing that all of them are just together. All of it is anime. And this isn't even a recent problem. And I'm going to sort of diagnose it as an anxiety of demographic, because I think that's what it is. But I'll clarify that in a bit more. But this has sort of always been a problem in a weird way where, on another episode of the Weeb Crew and other anecdotes I've heard from people who grew up on anime in the 90s, oftentimes what would happen is their parents, would take them to a video rental store. And there was still a perception that all these cartoons were just for kids. There was no distinction between the much more violent anime from, what you'd see on Disney. And so they'd let them rent something like fucking Ninja Scroll, which is this ero-guro, like highly sexual, highly violent, film for adults. And even going back to, my youth, like when Toonami started, it was, I think the original lineup was Dragon Ball Z, Gundam Wing, Sailor Moon, Cardcaptor Sakura. So they were initially, off the bat, attempting to evoke a demographic of gender. And, like, it makes sense, but something like Sailor Moon and Cardcaptor Sakura are specifically magical girl shows. They, their identity of femininity is pretty, obvious. Like, you can just look at it and see this is probably meant for girls, or at least it was designed to be appealing to girls primarily. We, over time, of course, have acknowledged that shonen and shoujo things have much wider readerships and viewerships than we can really give it credit for. It's not just young boys, it's not just young girls. It is, in fact, a wide variety. But, when you go over to the other side of the pond on Toonami and you have Dragon Ball Z, shonen battle manga that was adapted into an anime, versus Gundam Wing, which is not shonen. It was an anime original. And, theoretically, they thought these are just both for boys, but they're still very different. And they come from very different places. And yeah, people in Japan might still have been watching both of them. A lot of fans, they watch a lot of different things. But there was no distinction in that initial time to say these two things are different. In fact, they were actually, from very different contexts. One, I think Gundam Wing does have a manga, but, it was designed as an anime original. And Dragon Ball Z was not. It was a long-running manga that was adapted, mid-'80s and carried over for a while. So even the times that these things were released, Gundam Wing, I think, was later 90s. Dragon Ball, I think, ended in the early to mid-90s. Very different. But those sort of things are not distinguished. And this is anecdotally for me, growing up, all anime was just whatever I saw on TV, whatever people told me was anime. So for me, the perception was Fruits Basket, Death Note, two very different things. I didn't know what the difference was. I just knew they came from Japan. Therefore, they were both anime. And that's not wrong. But that's not the full truth of it either. Because those two things are very different. They come from very different places. And they're meant for very different people, debatably. So the issue at the heart of this is that we've sort of been isolated from the context of which all of our favorite shows have originally been produced, and we haven't really in any mass way attempted to correct the perception of who these things were meant for. And as such, this is something that I'll criticize Joe for a bit, because as he brings up the original target audiences of isekai in Japan, I don't think they really flirt with too much with the idea that like it's it almost doesn't matter in the American context now, because we have not ever been told those distinctions, and therefore we have homogenized entire rating and viewer bases based on just the shallow understanding of what they were without understanding where they came from. And that's just something we kind of have to deal with. And that's not a really good thing to think about, because, on one hand, Crunchyroll is going to indiscriminately market anything that it thinks is going to be a popular ticket. And under it's like, popular now, new this week, it's going to have all the different things, no matter what they are, no matter where they came from, right next to each other. And this is going to really skew what people think each thing was meant for. And it's already done that. And this has caused what I believe to be and diagnosed as an anxiety of demographic, where something like Mushoku Tensei, I see the reactions to that one online. There's a lot of criticism directed not just at the show itself, but sort of ad hominem to the fans of the show, for reasons I tangentially understand. I guess it's just voiced incels or something. And, I don't want to associate with them. So even I'm kind of preemptively wanting to distance myself from associating with that. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that in the same way that they start to acknowledge on the Weeb Crew episode, that these criticisms of isekai protagonists like Kirito for being, shallow, is itself a type of projection and an assumption on the author and the viewers who are reacting to Kirito, by saying that they are essentially only there as facilitators for male gaze and fantasy. But at the same time, what Joe points out is that those characters, in many ways, they have the same qualities of good and positive masculinity as the shonen characters, but they're in different contexts. And therefore, a lot of the criticisms people kind of leave at these characters is similar and in line with a lot of the criticisms that brought up in the 80s when the term otaku was made, because otaku was not a nice term when it was coined in, I think, Manga Buriko, is that right? I don't remember. Otsuka Eiji's magazine, where the person who coined the term was trying to disparage nerds and calling them, the nice way to call them was gay. It was a different word. But basically they said they only like fictional women because they don't go out to get real women because they're gay, which is a type of toxic masculinity, which is a specifically heterocentric one too. And I don't think that's gone away, because we still expect, people who watch these things and react to characters, we kind of still criticize them for being attracted to these characters for not going out to get real women. And it's like, well, why is that a thing? Like, why do we need to go out and get real women? Isn't that already a problematic thing itself to insist that we must get real women? I don't think real women want us to go get them, if you know what I'm saying. I think that's part of the problem, is that thought that we have to go get women. And I think it goes both ways. I don't think women really want us to start going after them, and I don't think we should want to just think that we have to go after them. And this is another part of the isekai, identity, is that the reason these authors or these characters are coded in such a way as to be sort of otaku-esque, to have most of their understanding of the world come through media, is because they had already deemed that the late-term capitalist system they lived in was sort of a, zero-sum game, that going out and performing those heteronormative functions the way that the state wanted them to keep the GDP up, to keep producing, just led to a spiritual isolation. So they figured, if I'm going to do that anyways, I'll just do it with things I like anime, video games, and manga. And I'll just, kind of live in this world where, I can go live a real life in the day and go to work and come home and sort of facilitate emotions through fantasy. Hi, me from the future here editing this video. I forgot an important thing to bring up in terms of the ways that people have criticized otaku in a toxic masculinity way, is that in the 2000s specifically, with a lot of the academia surrounded the moe phenomenon that arose after Neon Genesis Evangelion in the late 90s and sort of hit its peak in the 2000s, there was a sort of psychoanalysis of otaku as having invested into these female character images because they were treated as sort of deviants in Japanese society because they were specifically not going out to pursue, the heteronormative things that they were expected to, and therefore they were treated as aberrants. And, Tamaki Saito, the psychoanalyst, sort of attempts in Beautiful Fighting Girl, the book, to label them as like a sort of third gender. I don't really agree with Tamaki Saito on that conclusion, but the point I want to make is that there is a sort of reason to consider why men relating to female or femininity things are not just simply doing it out of like a juvenile fetishism. It might be a more complex issue related to their socioeconomic circumstance. And that to continue to say, well, you're just not going out to get real bread, real women is, part of the problem, in the sense that we don't, that's sort of the problem that incels have, right? Is that they believe that they're owed real women, but, they're not. And to say that like otaku who just sort of decide, well, we don't feel like we need to, we can kind of live an asexual life with just character images I feel like it's a bit of a double standard to say that is a problem in the same way that actively feeling entitled to real women is a problem. One more thing on the topic of anime and its depiction of masculinity, because I think a good way to compare where Pause and Select and F.D Signifier are coming from is to the German concept of Bildungsroman. So Bildungsroman sort of generally translates to our sort of idea of coming-of-age stories. And usually they depict a person who's raised in the society and eventually, after a sort of spout of delinquency or juvenile tendency, ends up, sort of reforming and molding into a functional citizen for their society. However, the problem and what a lot of Bildungsroman authors started to play around with was in the German society that these were being produced, there was a, criticism that, well, the society is imperfect and it has a lot of flaws to it. So how can we expect the young people to just assume and gain the proper Bildungs that would lead them to, grow up as the state wants it to? What if what the state wants them to grow up to be isn't proper and isn't ideal? And so a lot of Bildungsroman novels, especially the modernist kind, were directly about young people who related to the world through other forms of media. In this case, in like 20th century was, often literature and other young characters they read about, or how they saw themselves through other characters and their national identity. And this created different sorts of crises within them about how, the world wants them to grow up versus, how they feel manipulated to do so. A good example, for example, is like Catcher in the Rye, or James Joyce's Portrait of a Young Man. And we, on one hand, My Hero Academia might sort of be this ideal Bildungs and sort of emblemise what we should, or what we consider in a functional society, what we should be aiming for. But at the same time, something like isekai saying, well, that society isn't really functionable, and in fact has a lot of problems, and this is why we've had a crisis of masculinity that is depicted by somebody, being reincarnated into a world in which they do kind of find their niche and develop more properly than they would have otherwise in, that hegemonic Japanese system. So that's a good analogy to chew on for a bit and to help sort of clarify these positions and how we're applying them in terms of our, I had a belch there, analysis of masculinity. And there's a performative part to the way that otaku try to interact with this media. And I think something that we're a little skeptical of doing in the West, and Patrick Galbraith, in the sort of beginning of his book, Ethics of Affect, brings up this anecdote he has where in an anime con he was at in Japan, he met a U.S. soldier who seemed to kind of look at things in the virtual sense, but apply them with real fetish. So he kind of determined that this U.S. soldier didn't really differentiate between the fictional and the reality, whereas in Japan with otaku, they may want to specifically, because they understand that there's such a stigma, especially after like the Miyazaki murders of the late 80s, that they understand there's a stigma against enjoying fictional media in this way. So they want to draw their lines. They want to specifically relate to these things as fantasy, acknowledge that it is not real. It is purely an imaginary signifier. And in America, when we kind of look out and we see, something like incel culture that exists so virally, you have guys with Aaron Yeager profile pictures and stuff, like just posting all these weird misogynistic things and becoming weird Japanese nationalists despite the fact that they've never been to Japan in their life and they don't speak any Japanese. I can understand why people would be a lot more anxious about engaging with this idea, because we do have potentially a culture that is less willing to engage with performance in this way, to acknowledge that the emotions they have can be performative, that you can turn them on and off. And so we end up not differentiating between them as much as we should. And that's sort of a psychoanalytical criticism I can lobby towards, just American fandom as a whole, but I don't really know how accurate that would be. But that is an idea to posit in the relationship of this video, because I do think it is relevant as an idea. And so the anxiety in this case is brought out by the fact that we can't differentiate between performativity and earnestness. And earnestness as a toxic light, not, nice sincerity. We are worried that our own performance will lead us into situations in which we're interacting with people who are not actually performing. And this reflects badly on us as a result overall, because, you might like this thing, you might want to perform and act the way that is necessarily in a fictional context that helps kind of reinforce the fantasy as it's meant to facilitate. But guilt by association, ad hominem, people around you don't do that. And they don't differentiate properly. And you end up being sucked into this. And so you want to distance yourself and, maybe deny some of the things that you might enjoy about at work. And this does bring up, unfavorable judgments from, just judgmental people. And that's also a part of it. And it's just a strange environment that we've sort of found ourselves in as Western and English-speaking viewers when we're interacting with this media, and people who interact with it and maybe don't understand how, first off, to properly compartmentalize all of this media that is just sort of out there on one homogenized platform, and where we can insert ourselves in a social way that does not link us to the unsavory elements of this performance. Because it's difficult. It is very difficult to properly try and find a way without being an asshole. And so this, to me, is the root of this anxiety of demographic that I think, in order to alleviate, first off, we have to think about anime as not just anime. Like, we can't just keep thinking about it in the way the 2000s kind of, it's this quirky, wacky thing with big powers and spiky hair. Can't keep doing that. We need to properly understand the niches and the diversity inherent in anime and manga, and all the different types of creators and stories that are being produced and have been produced, and where they were produced. So we have to acknowledge the anime itself as an identity, as a continually expanding thing that is going to keep gaining more and more identity as it goes, is performative. And it takes on performative functions depending on where you are and how you view it and where you're applying it. Because otherwise, we're just going to keep going in circles and saying that all these shows are the same. They're all made for the same people when they might not be. And they all came from the same places and the same ideas and the same, straw men. And that's not very good. Because anime is really diverse. Anime is really fun because of how much different stuff there is and how many different people it caters to, despite somehow being, very fetishistic to itself as an industry and as a type of, aesthetic conglomerate. I think that's about it. I don't really know if I have much just to add, but otherwise, thank you, Weeb Crew, for making these cool live streams and podcasts. I really appreciate them. They've been filling up some of my downtime, so that's pretty good. Thank you very much.